300 Apache warriors don't appear at your farmstead by chance. They arrive seeking blood, demanding justice, or preparing for battle. Samuel Buck. Henderson was moments away from discovering their true purpose. But to understand this confrontation, we must return to where everything began 24 hours earlier, when a scorching Texas sun blazed down on Buck's property, somewhere between El Paso and the middle of nowhere. Chapter 1. An Unexpected Visitor. The brutal Texas heat beat down on Buck Henderson's farm as he worked to fix a broken water trough near the creek. At 36, Buck had faced countless hardships running his small spread, but something felt strange about this hot morning. Movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. A small figure was moving unsteadily across his land toward the water. Getting closer, Buck realized it was a child, no older than 10, stumbling with the shaky walk of someone pushed beyond their limits. The child wore traditional Apache clothing, now torn and dusty from days in the wild. Even from far away, Buck could see how hunger affected every difficult step. Most frontier settlers would have grabbed their guns first and asked questions later. Relations between homesteaders and the local Apache bands had been tense for years, with frequent fights keeping everyone on edge. But Buck had always handled things differently, maybe too kind for his own good. Setting down his tools, Buck walked slowly toward the child with careful, peaceful movements. As he got closer, he could see it was a young girl. Her dark eyes looked too big for her thin face, and her lips were cracked from lack of water. She looked up at him with a mix of fear and desperate hope that hit him like a punch to the gut. The girl spoke quickly in Apache. Buck couldn't understand the words, but her desperate gestures toward her mouth and the creek created a universal language of need that anyone could understand. Her small hand shook as she pointed first to her dry lips, then to the water, then back to herself in a plea that needed no translation. Buck thought about how his neighbors would react if they saw him helping an Apache child. He remembered the warnings he'd heard in town about growing problems with the tribal bands. Stories of raids and revenge attacks filled every conversation at the general store. The smart thing would be to send her away, to avoid the trouble that would surely follow. The safe thing would be to pretend he'd never seen her at all. But then he looked again into those begging eyes. Eyes that reminded him of his own son's desperate look during the fever that had taken his life 3 years ago. In that moment, Buck made the decision that would change everything. Without waiting, Buck lifted the girl into his arms. She felt almost weightless, her small body no heavier than a bundle of sticks. She didn't fight back. She was too weak from hunger and heat to struggle, even if she'd wanted to. As he carried her toward his cabin, he could feel her tiny body shaking. Whether from fear, exhaustion, or both, he couldn't tell. The girl's head rested against his shoulder, and Buck could hear her rough breathing. Each step toward his simple home carried him further from the quiet life he'd built and deeper into unknown territory. He'd sheltered stray cattle, cared for injured horses, and even helped travelers caught in sudden storms. But this was different. This child represented something far more complicated than simple kindness. As Buck reached his cabin door, the girl stirred weakly in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that held the smallest glimmer of hope. He realized that in just a few minutes, his world had completely changed. What happened next would decide not just the girl's fate, but quite possibly his own. Chapter 2. Acts of Compassion. Inside his simple cabin, Buck gently placed the girl in his only wooden chair and quickly began preparing food. He had beef stew left over from the night before, still warm on the stove, and fresh cornbread he'd baked that morning. The smell of the food seemed to wake the girl up a little, and for the first time, Buck saw what might have been hope flicker in her eyes. As he spooned stew into a bowl, Buck noticed something that made his blood freeze. Around the girl's neck, partly hidden by her torn clothes, hung a beautiful necklace. It had detailed beadwork and patterns he'd seen before. His neighbor, old Pete Morrison, had described those exact designs just last week. They were special beads worn only by the family of Chief Iron Wolf, the most powerful Apache leader in the territory. Buck's hand stopped halfway to give her the bowl. If this girl was who he thought she was, he wasn't simply helping a hungry child. He was sheltering the daughter of a man who could bring 300 warriors to his door without breaking a sweat. But it was too late to change his mind now. The girl was already reaching for the food with shaking hands, and Buck couldn't bring himself to turn her away. He handed her the bowl and watched as she ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen food in days. Every bite seemed to bring a little life back to her thin face. She ate carefully at first, as if she couldn't believe the food was real. Then faster, as her body remembered what it felt like to be fed. Buck sat down across from her, studying the intricate beadwork around her neck. The patterns told a story he was only beginning to understand. Red beads mixed with white and blue in designs that spoke of high rank and sacred ceremonies. This wasn't just any Apache child who had wandered onto his land. This was royalty in the truest sense of the word. What Buck didn't know was that 20 miles away, an Apache search party had just found the girl's trail leading straight to his farm. Chief Iron Wolf himself was leading the hunt, his face a mask of rage and grief that promised terrible consequences for whoever had taken his daughter. The great chief had been searching for 3 days, and his patience was running thin. The girl finished eating and looked up at Buck with something that might have been gratitude. She spoke softly in Apache, words he couldn't understand, but her tone was different now. Less desperate, more thankful. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like a name, then pointed to him with questioning eyes. Buck pointed to himself and said clearly, "Buck." The girl tried to repeat it, her young voice stumbling over the unfamiliar sound. It came out more like Baka, but it was close enough. Then she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. As afternoon shadows began stretching across his property, Buck couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made either the most noble decision of his life or the final one he'd ever make. The beads around her neck caught the light streaming through his window, reminding him that some acts of kindness come with a price he might not be ready to pay. Chapter 3: A Dangerous Recognition. The girl fell asleep in Buck's chair within an hour, exhaustion finally overwhelming her small body. Buck covered her with his only blanket and tried to convince himself he'd made the right choice. But as evening shadows stretched across his property, that confidence began to crumble like dry earth. The sound of approaching horses made his stomach lurch. Through his window, Buck watched 3 riders coming fast down the dirt road. He recognized them immediately. His neighbor Cletus Hartwell, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison, and Reverend Thomas from town. The way they rode suggested urgency, maybe even panic. Buck stepped outside before they could dismount, hoping to keep whatever conversation was coming quiet enough to avoid waking the sleeping girl. The evening air carried the scent of dust and approaching trouble. Cletus barely waited for his horse to stop before he started shouting. His face was red with a mixture of anger and fear that Buck had never seen before. The deputy looked grim, constantly glancing toward the hills as if expecting something to emerge from them. Even Reverend Thomas seemed nervous, fidgeting with his hat. They brought news that made Buck's blood run cold. Chief Iron Wolf's daughter had vanished 3 days ago during a hunting expedition. Word had spread through every settlement for 50 miles. The Apache were actively searching, and smoke signals had been spotted throughout the afternoon. Morrison's father had sent word from town about the missing girl, warning everyone to be on the lookout. Buck felt his throat tighten as the deputy studied his face with the careful attention of a man trained to spot lies. The smart move would be to deny everything, send them away, and handle this dangerous situation alone. But these men had been his neighbors for years. Despite their flaws and prejudices, they'd ridden out here in the gathering darkness because they were genuinely worried about his safety. The words came out before he could stop them. He told them about the girl inside, half-starved and exhausted. He explained that he couldn't have let a child die, regardless of the consequences. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush a man's soul. Reverend Thomas spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. The deputy was already backing toward his horse, talking about duty and head starts and getting the girl back to her people before they found Buck's farm. Cletus paced frantically, running his hands through his hair while talking about Iron Wolf's reputation for wiping out entire settlements. The deputy mounted his horse, explaining that he had to report this, but would give Buck time to act. Cletus followed suit, shaking his head and muttering about Buck having too much heart for his own good. The Reverend was last to leave, promising prayers and expressing doubt about whether they would be enough. As the three men disappeared into the darkness, Buck stood alone listening to the girls' quiet breathing from inside the cabin. He considered his options, trying to find the Apache camp in the dark, loading her into his wagon for a desperate ride to town, or simply waiting for whatever was coming. None of them offered much hope for survival. Every path seemed to lead to the same destination: a confrontation with one of the most feared war chiefs in all of Texas. Chapter 4: Mounting Tensions. As the three men disappeared into the darkness, Buck stood alone in the growing night, listening to the girls' quiet breathing from inside the cabin. The weight of his situation pressed down on him like the heavy Texas heat. He had helped a starving child, but now he faced consequences he never could have imagined. Buck walked back inside and sat down at his small wooden table, running his hands through his hair. The girl slept peacefully in his chair, wrapped in his only blanket. She looked so small and harmless. It was hard to believe that this tiny person could bring 300 warriors to his door. But those beads around her neck told a different story. They spoke of power, of blood ties to the most feared chief in the territory. He considered his choices, each one more dangerous than the last. He could saddle up his horse and try to find the Apache camp in the darkness. But approaching an Apache war party at night would be suicide. They would shoot first and ask questions later. He thought about loading her into his wagon and making a run for the nearest town. But that would only make him look more guilty, like he was trying to escape with stolen goods. The smart thing would be to wake the girl and somehow explain that she needed to go home. But she was still too weak to travel far. And even if he could get her to understand, how would he get her safely back to her people without getting himself killed in the process? The language barrier made everything 10 times harder. Buck stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the empty plains. The moon was rising, casting long shadows across his property. Everything looked peaceful and normal, but he knew that was about to change. Somewhere out there, Chief Iron Wolf was probably gathering his warriors, preparing for battle. The thought made his stomach turn. As if summoned by his fears, a new sound drifted across the prairie. At first, Buck thought it might be his imagination. Then it came again, clearer this time. The distant rhythm of war drums grows steadily closer with each passing moment. The slow, steady beat seemed to match his racing heartbeat, but was much more threatening. Buck's blood turned to ice. He had hoped they would wait until morning, giving him time to figure out a plan. But the Apache weren't known for their patience when it came to missing family members. They were coming tonight, and they were coming in force. The drumming grew louder, joined by other drums in a pattern that Buck had heard described but never experienced himself. This wasn't the random noise of a celebration or ceremony. This was the organized sound of war, of warriors preparing for battle. Each beat seemed to say the same thing. Someone would pay for taking Chief Iron Wolf's daughter. Buck rushed back into the cabin, his mind racing. The war drums were getting closer, and he could now make out individual beats in the rhythm. They seemed to be coming from multiple directions, surrounding his property like a tightening noose. The girl stirred in the chair, awakened by the sound that was both familiar and terrifying to her. Her eyes opened wide, and for the first time since he'd found her, Buck saw true recognition cross her face. She knew exactly what those drums meant, and the fear in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. The Apache were coming, and Buck was running out of time. Chapter 5: The Siege Begins. Buck rushed back into the cabin, his mind racing with panic. The war drums were getting louder, and he could now make out individual beats in the rhythm. Slow, steady, and absolutely terrifying. This wasn't the chaotic noise of a raiding party. This was something far more organized and infinitely more dangerous. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding his small farm like an invisible wall of threat. The girl stirred in the chair, awakened by the sound of the drums. Her eyes opened wide, and for the first time since he'd found her, Buck saw complete recognition cross her face. She understood what those drums meant better than he ever could. The fear that flickered in her dark eyes told him everything he needed to know about what was coming. She spoke rapidly in Apache, pointing toward the door and then at herself. Even without understanding the words, Buck could see the panic in her movements. She was trying to tell him something important, something that might save both their lives. But the language barrier made communication nearly impossible. Her small hands moved frantically as she tried to explain what only she could understand. Buck knelt down beside her chair, speaking as calmly as he could manage despite the terror growing in his chest. He told her he was trying to help, that he knew those drums meant her people were coming for her. The girl nodded desperately, then grabbed his shirt and pulled him toward the window. She pointed outside and held up both hands, opening and closing her fingers repeatedly. Buck counted along with her movements, his heart sinking with each number. 10, 20, 30. She kept going, her small fingers working frantically. 50, 60, 70. Still, she continued, and Buck realized with growing horror what she was trying to tell him. When she finally stopped, she had counted what looked like 300. Buck's legs nearly gave out beneath him. 300 warriors. He had been hoping for maybe a dozen angry braves that he could somehow reason with. But 300 warriors meant this wasn't just a rescue mission. This was a full war party, enough to destroy every farm for 100 miles around. The drums stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Buck moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar shapes of his property in the moonlight. Then, like ghosts emerging from the night itself, he began to make out movement across his land. They came in perfect formation, warriors on horseback spread out in a wide half circle that was slowly closing around his cabin. Even in the pale moonlight, Buck could see the war paint on their faces, the feathers in their hair, and the weapons in their hands. These weren't men who had come to talk. These were warriors who had come to settle a debt with blood. The girl tugged on Buck's sleeve again, this time pointing to herself and then toward the door. She wanted to go to them, but Buck couldn't tell if that would help or make everything worse. What if they thought he had hurt her? What if they didn't believe she had come to him willingly? What if her presence with him was seen as proof of his guilt rather than his innocence? A single voice called out from the darkness, speaking in English with a heavy accent but perfect clarity. The words carried across the night air like a death sentence, clear and final and absolutely terrifying in their simple message. Chapter 6, The Trial. The voice that called out from the darkness carried absolute authority, cutting through the night air like a blade. Buck recognized the tone immediately, even if he didn't understand all the words. This was the voice of someone used to being obeyed without question. This had to be Chief Iron Wolf himself, and Buck was about to face the most dangerous conversation of his life. Buck made the hardest decision he'd ever faced. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside with his hands raised high, the girl following close behind him. The sight that greeted him was something straight out of his worst nightmares. 300 Apache warriors sat perfectly still on their horses, forming a complete circle around his property. War paint gleamed in the moonlight, and every weapon was pointed directly at him. The scene was both beautiful and terrifying. The warriors sat like statues, their horses barely moving, creating an image that looked like something from an ancient legend. But there was nothing legendary about the very real danger Buck faced. These men had come prepared for war, and he was standing in the center of their target. At the front of the formation sat a man who could only be Chief Iron Wolf. He was massive and imposing, with silver streaking through his long black hair. His eyes seemed to burn with barely controlled fury, and every muscle in his body spoke of a lifetime spent in battle. This was a man who had united several tribes under his leadership, who had never lost a fight against the cavalry. And now Buck was about to face him in a conversation that could end with everyone dead. The girl ran toward her father, calling out in Apache. But instead of the joyful reunion Buck had expected, Iron Wolf's expression grew even darker. The chief dismounted and knelt beside his daughter, examining her carefully while she spoke rapidly. She gestured back toward Buck and the cabin, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement to explain what had happened. Buck couldn't understand the words, but he could read the chief's body language like a book written in fear. Every muscle in Iron Wolf's frame was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into violence. Whatever the girl was telling him, it wasn't making the situation better. If anything, the chief looked angrier with each word his daughter spoke. Finally, Iron Wolf stood and walked toward Buck with slow, deliberate steps that seemed to count down the seconds of Buck's life. The other warriors remained on their horses but shifted their weapons. The subtle movement created a sound like rattlesnakes preparing to strike, and Buck felt sweat running down his back despite the cool night air. Iron Wolf stopped just outside arm's reach, close enough that Buck could see the detailed scars on the chief's chest. These were marks of countless battles won and enemies defeated. Each scar told a story of violence and victory, and Buck realized he was looking at a man who had probably killed more people than Buck had ever met. When Iron Wolf finally spoke, his English was perfect but cold as winter wind. He talked about what his daughter had told him, about shelter and food and kindness. But there was no gratitude in his voice, only suspicion and barely controlled rage. Buck tried to explain, his voice steadier than he felt. He talked about the starving child, about not being able to let her die. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see they weren't enough. The chief's eyes never left his face, studying him like a hunter studies prey. Chapter 7. Understanding and Peace. Buck's mind raced as he stared at 300 arrow points glinting in the moonlight. How do you prove goodness to a man who has seen nothing but evil from your people? Then inspiration struck like lightning in a clear sky. Buck slowly reached into his pocket, causing every warrior to tense. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small piece of torn fabric from the girl's original clothing that had caught on his fence post. He explained that he had kept it because he thought Iron Wolf might want proof that his daughter hadn't been harmed. Iron Wolf examined the torn cloth, recognition flickering in his eyes. It was indeed from his daughter's ceremonial dress, the one she had been wearing when she disappeared. Buck's voice grew stronger as he continued. He described how the girl had come to his water source on her own, how he could have driven her away or shot her as a trespasser. Instead, he had carried her to his home, given her his own food and blanket, and asked for nothing in return. The girl suddenly spoke up, tugging on her father's arm and pointing back toward the cabin. She ran to the door and motioned for him to follow. Confused but curious, Iron Wolf gestured for Buck to come with him inside. In the cabin, the girl pointed to the chair where she had slept, then to the empty bowl where Buck had served her stew. She acted out eating and sleeping, then pointed to Buck and smiled. The first genuine smile Buck had seen from her. But Iron Wolf's attention was focused on something else entirely. On the table sat Buck's most prized possession, a small photograph of his own family. His wife and young son were both killed in a disease outbreak 3 years ago. The picture was worn from handling, surrounded by dried wildflowers that Buck replaced every week. Iron Wolf picked up the photograph, studying the faces of Buck's lost family. When he spoke, his voice held something other than anger for the first time. "You have lost children, too," the chief said quietly. "My boy was about her age," Buck replied, his throat tight. "Maybe that's why I couldn't turn her away." Iron Wolf was quiet for a long moment, still holding the photograph. The girl continued chattering in Apache, apparently telling her father every detail of how Buck had cared for her. "She says you could have taken advantage," Iron Wolf finally said. "A lone white man with an Apache child. You could have demanded payment, could have used her as protection. Instead, you fed her and let her rest." Buck nodded. "I've got no quarrel with your people, Chief. I just work my land and try to live in peace." When Iron Wolf finally spoke again, his words surprised everyone, including his own daughter. "My warriors expected to find a kidnapper tonight. They expected to burn this place to the ground and take your scalp back as proof of our justice." He set the photograph down carefully. "Instead, we find a man who showed kindness to a child who could have been his enemy. What followed changed both their lives forever." Iron Wolf declared that Buck would be granted the protection of the Apache tribe. Any Apache who harmed Buck or his property would answer to the tribal council. In return, Buck promised to show the same kindness to any Apache who came to him in need. Buck's farm became neutral ground where Apache and settlers could meet safely. And every year, on the anniversary of that night, Iron Wolf's daughter, now grown into a respected peacekeeper between two cultures, would visit Buck's farm to share a meal and remember the moment when two worlds chose understanding over warfare. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what you would do in Buck's position.